As was mentioned, I will talk today about pathogen transmission at the feed mill. Dr. Woodworth did a great job of getting us started today, and some of it you'll hear is repetitive, which is good because that means it's very important. I don't think there's certain things in these talks that we can't stress enough, and I know Tim will reiterate some of this information as well. So I think as we start the topic, the first thing that came to my mind is we need to understand how this can happen. I went back to some of Scott D's work. We talk about fomite transfer a lot when we talk in terms of biosecurity, certainly at the farm level, but we need to think about it in terms of at feed mill level as well. Therefore, if we think of a fomite as anything that entering the farm has the potential to transmit disease, that also includes your feed and your feed mill delivery people, as well as the trucks. So today we will spend some time. We're going to discuss those areas of greatest risks. I'm going to share a study with you that we concluded with 25 other feed mills in the U.S. and some of the findings that we found as far as areas of greatest risk of potential contamination. And then we're going to talk about some of the places that we've looked at to minimize that risk. So certainly when we sat down as a group, as a system, a year and a half ago, we started going through identifying the areas that we felt were potentially the greatest risk for pathogen introduction at the feed mill. The first one, of course, was ingredients. We certainly sat around the table, asked if we knew our suppliers, visited with our suppliers, asked them if they knew about where their ingredients were coming from, how they were being handled, transported, etc. And of course, we also acknowledged that many of the ingredients were sourced outside of the U.S., particularly when we started to identify the origin of PED. Of course, most of the PED movement occurred during the winter, and so some of the topics in our office was concerning sludge and contamination, and going out to the feed mill directly, and we'll share some pictures with you of how that potentially could happen. So are we seeing trucks contaminated during transport? Are we seeing areas over the receiving pits that maybe could be cleaned, or other opportunities for pathogens to drop into those ingredient pits? Certainly farm delivery trucks, once you have a PED positive site and you're delivering feed, what's the potential risk that you're bringing virus back to the feed mill from that site? And then obviously feed mill personnel. So to share you a little bit of information that we had developed when our system first broke, one of my charges was to go out and try to identify how this could happen. We had, in a matter of a couple of days, multiple farms breaking in geographically isolated areas, an hour apart from each other, but they were all being fed out of a common feed mill. So the feed mill, of course, became a very common thing for us to go track. So these are just some very simple areas that we sampled at that feed mill over the course of a day. And we submitted those samples through a Swiffer test, of course, submitted those through the diagnostic labs, and we did find a handful of suspect samples for PEDV. What is interesting is these bulk trailers, these bulk delivery trailers, were delivering distillers grains that we collected. And those, of course, would be the two that were suspect. And they were delivering over this pit, which, of course, was also suspect. We also did find this feed trailer. This feed trailer had come back from a farm that was PEDV positive that day. It was a snowy day. I pulled the snowball off of the truck, and that's what we found was suspect. Now, what's interesting, in the course of the week, my other colleague there at the production site went back out to this feed mill. He continued to track that limestone pit, that distiller's limestone receiving pit. We continue to get distillers feed deliveries every day. But then at the end of the week, we received limestone. So prior to that, every day, the sample site was coming up suspect. And when the limestone came, he resampled, and the test result was negative. So for us, it was a pretty big flag because we know limestone has the ability to neutralize PEDV, and it was certainly an indicator that this was probably, even though it was suspect, a very real opportunity for contamination. So this is what started us down the path, talking to many colleagues, some of which are in the group today. We would have Friday morning calls, and one of the discussions was, well, what's the real risk to the feed mill? We've talked about feed being contaminated. We've talked about the feed mill potentially dragging the virus. So where is the real risk within the mill? And can we identify those areas as being potential risks for either PEDV or Delta coronavirus. So over the summer of last year, we took 24 feed mills from various regions of the U.S., and we sampled 6 areas within each feed mill. So the areas that we sampled would have been the foot pedals of the feed delivery truck, the bulk ingredient unloading pit, the inside of the mixer or the pellet cooler, the mill office floor, the inside of one of the feed compartments of the feed trucks going to the farms, and then the incoming bagged ingredient truck. So we collected those samples for up to 5 days at each mill, and then we submitted those for PEDV and Delta testing. To give you a little bit of background before we get into the probabilities and risk assessments, of the feed mills that we tested, 75% of the mills were supplying feed to farm sites that were known to be either PEDV positive, and then 25 or 21% were Delta corona positive. Sorry. In our findings, no feed mill sample tested positive for PEDV. But we did have 5% of the truck foot pedals and 1% of the bulk ingredient pit samples testing suspect for PEDV. Porcine Delta coronavirus, however, was found as positive samples on 3.4% of the foot pedals of the trucks, and we had suspect samples in 2.2% of the office floor samplings. So we'll go through this in a little bit of a step-by-step approach. Did I miss the slide? Yes, I did. Okay. So first we'll talk about PEDV and then we'll talk about Delta because they are a little bit different actually in our findings. We divided the feed mills obviously up into those that were servicing PED positive farms versus PEDV negative farms. And what we found was over the course of time, if we sampled for 5 days, we had a 30% chance of finding a PEDV suspect sample on the foot pedal of a truck that was feeding a PED positive farm. We had also found some samples testing positive in the bulk delivery pit area, and then we did have some that actually tested suspect for PEDV actually in the compartment inside your feed delivery truck. However, if we looked at any PEDV feed mill that was feeding PEDV negative herds, we found no samples testing positive or suspect. And trying to understand what is my risk or how many days should I collect if I want to understand my risk at the feed mill. We ask that question in terms of negative results. If I continue to test on a day-to-day basis, what's the chance of getting a negative result? So back up please, thank you. So on sample day 1 here, if I were to test that pedal, there's a 73% chance that I could still find PED suspect samples. But after testing for 5 consecutive days, that risk reduced to 67%. We don't see that the risk relatively changes on many of these areas. There's still a relative risk because of the number of suspect samples that we had over the course of time. But particularly in the foot pedal of the feed delivery truck, that's where our risk goes down because obviously that was where our greatest number of samples were found positive or suspect. Apologize. And again, this is just a reiteration of that we can see over time. The more samples we're collecting on those common areas, the more confident we can feel that we are getting true and accurate results. So if we look in terms of Delta corona, when I surveyed the feed mills, we had 5 feed mills that knew they were feeding Delta positive farms, 8 that really weren't sure what they were feeding in terms of Delta corona positive farms, and then 11 that knew they were feeding Delta negative farms. Again, our foot pedal in our Delta positive feed mills was at the highest risk. 58% by 5 days were testing positive or suspect. But what became interesting in all of our findings was the feed mills that were feeding either the Delta unknowns or the Delta negative farms, we actually found Delta suspect samples on their office floors. So even though they weren't feeding anything that could potentially be trafficking the virus, they were still in fact finding it. So again, if we look in terms of how many days to sample, we found fewer Delta positive samples overall, so the probability by day 5 of finding a Delta positive was reduced down to 16% on the foot pedal comparative to PEDV. And again, this is just a geographic or just a graph to help demonstrate that. So overall, what this study showed us was that there are clearly areas in the feed mill that are at higher risk than others. We certainly understand that if we are feeding farms that are PED positive or Delta positive, we do run a higher risk of those feed mills having potential sites for contamination. So we're going to walk through a couple of these with some of these slides, and as Jason demonstrated on some of this you've already seen, but we'll go through it. So the first area that I want to talk about is transport. And we'll talk about both unloading and receiving ingredients, and then also transport out to the feed, to the actual farms with feed delivery. We understand that some of our older mills, it is sometimes difficult to unload trucks. We'll have different types of trucks coming in. We might have our local farmer down the road bringing in corn, or we might be getting it in trains in various ways depending on the size of the feed mill. So we do have some challenges there in setting up the structure. But this is just a geographical picture of a feed mill. This is the area where the feed trucks are coming in to receive feed to take it out to the farm. And back here is actually the unloading area for incoming ingredients. And this was the current route that the feed trucks were taking. So they were coming in on one side of the feed mill, receiving their feed, and then heading out. But the question is why are we doing that? Because we've actually created an opportunity for cross-contamination. And so the preferred route would actually be to come in from one entrance and leave from another. So these are some simple steps, possibly, if you're building a new feed mill, they're really simple. But if you're in an existing, you might have to consider, can we have an exit, which is separate from the entrance of the feed mill, to try to prevent that cross-trafficking. And that's going to go both directions, whether it's an ingredient truck or a feed delivery truck. We do want to try to minimize these events from happening. So when we talk in terms of the ingredient unloading trucks, what are some things we can do? Well, we know that these trucks are going to have to go across the scales. Scales are going to be common, whether it's our feed trucks or bulk ingredient trucks. They're going to have to cross. So there may not be much there that we can do, but we do need to understand that process. We may start the timing of deliveries at different times of day to try to minimize that cross activity. However, what we do need to think about are the drivers that are coming to the sites with these bulk ingredients. We want to make sure that these drivers stay separate from the areas where the feed is being mixed, and we would prefer to keep them separate from where other mill staff would be interacting. If the drivers do need to exit their trucks, we should consider having disinfectant mats available. But certainly in the areas where they're unloading, we want to ensure that they have no direct access to where the feed is being manufactured. And we should have a phone or a walkie-talkie or something there that if that individual is having difficulties unloading his ingredients, that he can contact somebody at the feed mill rather than walking through the manufacturing area trying to find somebody to assist him. The other area to consider is when the ingredient pit is done being used for the day, we should consider covering that and making sure that no birds or anything else can walk through it. So these are some examples of some images that people have done to try to minimize that potential for the ingredient unloading pit to become contaminated. This is a little hard to see, but this is actually plywood that's been laid over the grate of the pit. And then they actually have some feed boxes here for the feed to be, or I'm sorry, the bulk ingredient to be dropped down into. So this is a closer picture of that. But again, trying to minimize, if there's snow on this part of the trailer, that it's not dropping down into the pit, but actually dropping away from where ingredients are going down into storage. If we can at all, if we can develop a grate so that it is not over where the tires would be, that would be preferred. However, if you're in an older feed mill and that grate is long and it goes the span of the tire length, you might want to consider a rubber mat or a metal grate, something solid that would again prevent those tires from potentially dropping things into your ingredient pits. The other question when you're walking your feed mill, if you do see that they're using the boxes and you have an incident like this, what do they do with it? Just like Jason discussed with the dust, are we going to scoop it up and drop it in the pit? Or are we going to have a compost area out back that we can remove that product so that we're not potentially dragging something into the pit? Again, when we're loading complete feed, these feed drivers are what I would really classify as a higher risk, particularly based on the feed mill study that we did. With the foot pedals being contaminated, it's likely that their boots or their shoes could also be contaminated. So we want to keep them confined to the loadout area and to the break room. And we should consider things like using flooring that allows material on the bottom of their shoes to fall away. So if they are wearing boots to the farm and then they're coming to the feed mill to use the restroom or to take their lunch break, that they're not potentially sharing any snow or ice or water across different people's shoes. So this is an example of the area where the truck drivers will come in. This is their personal vending area and break room. This is tri-bar flooring that we set up there, so anything on their shoes will drop down. This is a separation. There's a window here where they can talk to the individuals making the feed, but in order for them to walk through here, they would have to enter a locked door. So you do try to keep items separate on that as well. Frozen sludge was an area of large concern when PED first came out. These were some images that I took that day I first went out to look at the feed mill. You can see here this is a large ball of snow that's hanging off the bottom of the truck. It's a little hard to see here, but there's also water droplets. So those water droplets are continuing to drop to whether this is a feed delivery truck or a bulk ingredient truck coming in, that are potentially dropping materials either into your incoming pit or into areas where you might have people manufacturing feed walking by. So again, when we saw this image, the first thought that came to mind was some of the work that Dee had done looking at the frozen snowball effect and its ability to carry PRRS virus. And again, we demonstrated this with some of the samples that we took as well, that we were able to find PEDV sitting in that snow from the feed truck that had just come back from delivering feed to a PED positive site. So we understand that snow runs the risk of carrying the disease. Certainly if you've got incoming ingredients into the pit, that snow can drop into the pit, contaminate your corn storage or your distiller's storage. But as I mentioned, you can also have foot traffic that can move that around. So what should we do in terms of snow? We live in the Midwest. Snow is going to happen. Some of the suggestions that we've had is park your trucks just to the edge of the feed mill and go out with a scraper and knock off some of the bigger pieces before they're actually allowed to enter the areas of the feed mill, whether it's for unloading or for receiving. Some of the other things that we've actually considered is looking at extra bulk storage. So on a day that we consider a high, what we define as a high sludge day or large amounts of snow, likely, we will not allow incoming ingredients to happen on those days. We'll actually cancel those deliveries and take them the next day. Again, just trying to minimize that risk of bringing in unnecessary items. Again, vermin control is going to be a priority. Certainly want to make sure the bait stations are located outside the mill, away from manufacturing, so we don't have a potential toxicity issue, but we want to make sure that we are reducing any rats. After yesterday, bats will be a concern, but certainly also we want to be thinking about birds. How often do we see a flock of birds out on the gravel picking off corn that's come off the tops of the feed trucks after they've been unloaded? So we certainly want to watch those areas. Again, make sure our pits are covered at night, so if those birds do choose to come onto the feed mill property, they cannot defecate into your pit. Feed deliveries, Jason did a nice job of this, so I'm not going to talk much about it, but certainly we want to implement that biosecurity pyramid. After the data that we've seen, we need to put careful thought into those foot pedals and certainly into the floor mats, disinfecting them on a regular basis, setting up a program of when we're going from farm to farm, how are we going to handle those foot pedals and potentially boots. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about ranking the ingredient risk. Every feed mill obviously has different ingredients coming in. They're supplied from different groups, and so we can't stand up here today and say this is how you need to rank your ingredients. But you need to ask the questions, how fast is your inventory used? How's your product received? And how's that product stored before arrival? So this is work, obviously, that Scott D has just recently released, where we talk about soybean meal and the number of days that soybean meal can stay positive with PEDV. Certainly a lot longer than what most of us had thought a year ago. And we can also see here that we're looking at products like distillers that looks to be positive for at least 30 days out. So not just animal products, we certainly need to consider our grain products as well, and their potential to hold on to that virus and keep it actually active. So when we talk in terms of bulk storage, if you go to your facilities and your suppliers, how are those products being stored before you pick them up? So distillers or bakery goods, are they in flat storage? Have you ever been? Are there birds flying in and out of that flat storage? It might be covered, but are there birds in and out? And it's likely overhead loadouts. So we've actually seen pictures of places where you'll pull right into the overhead covered area, and the product will be on each side, and the skipster will come by and pick up the product and dump it in, and then they'll fill it into your truck. But everybody's vehicle is going right in the middle of where that ingredient is. And so we want to talk in terms of contamination. You need to look at that. You need to ask your suppliers, how are you handling this product and how are you controlling for it? Bags and totes, certainly, are we having products that are coming in bags that we can hold on to for periods of time to allow for virus to become inactivated? And finally, liquid products. Larger mills that use a lot of product can't typically do this, but some of our smaller mills, particularly that are receiving liquid fat, can they hold it in the fat tank for a couple of days once it's arrived to allow it to heat and use time and temperature to our advantage? Can we use a non-fat diet for a couple of days just to allow for this to happen? Finally, feed mitigation. Jason showed some nice data there, so I'm not going to go into it. I certainly listed a couple there, but there are obviously more choices for feed mitigation, whether they are actual additives or mechanical process such as pelleting. So in conclusion, when we look at the feed mill and we look at the risk associated with the feed mill, the risks are multifold as for those opportunities for a pathogen to enter the feed mill. We know that feed mills are working with active facilities, and those that are working with those facilities have a greater chance of potentially bringing the virus back to the feed mill. And so we need to make sure that we do a very good job of mitigating those activities to try to stop that from happening. But as you go forward, it's not just the staff that are moving from farm to farm. We certainly need to think about all of the other incoming areas and ingredients that are coming into the feed mill.